Hello, welcome back to our Through the Bible study. If you can turn with me where we left off in the book of Genesis, chapter 16. We left off with the life of Abraham, and we'll be moving into more of his legacy as we discuss not only his major triumphs, but also some of his major defeats, in noting that God doesn't use perfect people, he uses forgiven people. And that's good news, because all of us here can't claim perfection. And if you tend to lift the Old Testament and New Testament saints up on pedestals, understand the opposite is true. They are just as imperfect as me and you. The good news is God loves us just as we are, and he forgave us even while we were yet sinners. So, understanding the founding of many traditions and principles that are actually going to be reinstituted throughout the entirety of the Old Testament, we're going to be discussing kind of a snowball effect of a mistake made in the past concerning Abram lying about Sarai being his wife to the Egyptian Pharaoh, so guys wouldn't get jealous, kill him, and take his loot, including his girl, and not trusting God to protect him. Pharaoh took her into his harem, and stuff happened. God resolved that issue pretty quickly. But going into chapter 16 and verse 1, Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bore him no children, and she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. Again, pick this girl up in Egypt where that first major compromise happened. We see that the theme is consistent. So Sarai said to Abram, See now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go into my maid, perhaps I shall obtain children by her. And Abram heeded the voice of Sarai. Then Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. So Sarai, essentially wanting to help God out in his plan for their family. Girls back then didn't have a lot of social rights, so to speak. And the only way that they could get any measure of respect was through having lots of babies for their husband to be able to bring up and train to plow the back nine and so forth. But Sarai, essentially, and again, this isn't biblical, this is my suggestion and interpretation of the text, probably wanting to eliminate any competition as far as the deck goes in her favor of it being her fault, Abram's fault, or God's fault, whoever she's blaming, and whatever her motives, she suggests surrogate parenting. And that's not as old a new and revolutionary an idea as we give it credit for. And also understanding also on a side note that Sarai was making a mistake in doubting God first, but Abram didn't have to go along with it. And understand, between husbands and wives, boyfriend and girlfriends, all, if you are being called into a relationship with somebody, and even with good intentions, they suggest something that dishonors God, it's up to you to be the spiritual leader and actually say, no, this is what God's word says and I'm standing for it. But unfortunately, Abram did not make that decision, and this is not something that God condoned. He wouldn't speak to them for a great number of years. I believe it was over 13 after this event. So he went in to Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes. Then Sarai said to Abram, My wrong be upon you. I gave my maid into your embrace, and when she saw she had conceived, I became despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between you and me. So Abram said to Sarai, Indeed your maid is in your hand, do to her as you please. And when Sarai dealt harshly with her, she fled from her presence. Now, essentially, whatever Sarai's intentions was, it definitely backfired, because we see some venom being loosed on Abram when her plan actually ends up working out. But for the most part, it was just social issues between girls. Hagar, even though she worked for Sarai as a maid, when she had essentially been in on this cultural idea that only girls that have lots of children are worth anything in that society back then, she would basically just walk around with her baby bump and saying, like, look at me, I got one up on you. Doesn't look like one of us is the girl in the house who can actually use her organs. And Sarai did not like this one bit, as I assume and naturally understand any girl would not want to hear. So she takes it first out on her husband verbally, and then physically upon Hagar, and Abram consents to nothing. So we understand that Abram was not only imperfect, but he was far from it in any regard. Sarai was physically abusive to Hagar, and that term dealt harshly, and naturally so, Hagar ran away from that hazardous environment. Now, when we get into verse 7, we get an interesting turn of events in regard to Hagar and this time in her life during her pregnancy. Verse 7, Now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by a spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, Sarai's maid. He identifies her as still having that role. Where have you come from, and where are you going? So, the term angel, it's a very misinterpreted term in a lot of texts that actually haven't taken the time to discuss really where angels come from. You passages like Isaiah 4, Ezekiel 1, and Revelation 4, 5, 16, 12, 19, and many others that mention angels, messengers from God in detail, and that's actually what the word in Hebrew, angel, means. Malak, or malakim, plural, in Hebrew, it means messenger. So essentially, someone representing God as a messenger. But I would suggest to you that this is actually, in the original language, the angel of the Lord would literally just translate out as Malach Yahweh. Now, Malach Yahweh, that literally means God bearing message. So, what a lot of people would actually consider this to be is what's called a theophany. And a theophany is when God physically interacts with man. There is a physical incarnation and interaction with man and God before the total incarnation of him in the person of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ's life being a consistent and long-term theophany. But we're going to be seeing many of these appearances, not only in the book of Genesis, Exodus, Joshua, Deuteronomy, Numbers, and, well, pretty much the Old Testament, and then well into the New. And I understand that this is the focus of the Bible. The message of God's Word is focusing and centering itself around the fact that God is interacting with man, and that this is literally God's story, and how he's bringing his Son into his people. So it's only naturally you might want to peek in on the process and help guide things along the way. So not to say that he needed to do so, but it helped. So he met Hagar out in the wilderness after having run away, and this messenger from God, again possibly Jesus himself, asked Hagar a question that we should oftentimes ask ourselves when we find ourselves in very poor circumstances. Where have you been, and where is it leading you to? Look at the past, look at the future, because obviously you're in the present. Where are these decisions going to lead? And in verse 9, Hagar's response, she said, I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, Return to your mistress and submit yourself under her hand. Then the angel of the Lord said to her, I will multiply your descendants exceedingly, so that they shall not be counted for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, Behold, you are with child, and you shall bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction. He shall be a wild man. His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of his brethren. Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, You are the God who sees. Now note it says the Lord who spoke to her. So again, further confirmation that this is likely a theophany. For she said, I have also here seen him who sees me. Therefore the well was called Ber Lahai Roi. Observe, it is between Kadesh and Bered. So a little geography to know where this well and this event happened. Especially for the people who would actually be able to see it in that day. And for us as well, we can know where this place was too. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram named his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. So the overarching events and theme of what had actually happened here was that this child is announced by God, that he asks Hagar to return to Sarah, or Sarai. She wouldn't be called Sarah until later. But not exactly the best set of circumstances, not exactly the thing that you would come up with on your own. But God personally came to Hagar and said, I'm going to take care of you, and I'm going to take care of your baby. I'm going to bless him. I'm going to use him. Not in the same way that he would Abram. But Every single life was sacred, even though this baby would be a little bundle of trouble. And I'm not just talking about terrible twos, I'm talking the whole family legacy. The Arab people would be born from the descendants of Ishmael. And to this day, they continue to be a very, very strong problem for not only world affairs, but world events. And yet, God saved them. He could have let Hagar and Ishmael both die out here. He could have Hagar or Sarai's beatings of Hagar result in a miscarriage, and God would have condoned. But guess what? God doesn't support the death of babies, does he? There is no child conceived that he considers an accident. And even though this baby would cause some trouble, it would be a serious inconvenience and even risk of lives of some people, that he valued this child's life and he would use it. So note that when we see this child being born, being the father of the Arab people, he was promised to be a great nation and that God would use him. There would be a lot of trouble along the way, but you need to understand that God loves the Arab people. That God has a plan for the Arab people. Otherwise, he'd let them all die here. Recognize that. No life is wasted. No life is more or less valuable. It all comes from the same source. And it is up to him and him alone who decides when and why a life should be ended. Also recognize as well, he could use Hitler too, but he couldn't bless him along the way. That was up to him. So, continuing, we get a little context, so to speak, as far as when this was. He was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. Then the next following verse in chapter 17 says, when Abram was 99 years old. So, if my subtraction is right, 13 years have passed. And God has not spoken to Abram since. That's kind of what happens when we stop trusting God. We don't want him around us. He respects our space and privacy. But also understand that God did not abandon Abram either. The communication was just cut off. And while it is a natural result of sin, when we get into the Psalms, understand that some of the worst times in David's life weren't when he was facing the consequences socially for his sin, but when the ultimate comfort that he got out of his fellowship and relationship with God was separated, that was the thing he longed for most. Not just the reality of his salvation and just learning to wait until he could be with God, but he couldn't even live living without Jesus. He couldn't even live living knowing that God couldn't speak to him as a result of his actions, and would do anything to restore that gap. And we understand, and when we get into the Levitical law as well as in Exodus, where the principles and severity of sin is discussed, exactly why God takes these things so seriously. And as we get into these things, understand that when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am Almighty God, walk before me and be blameless. Now, Abram was not blameless. We literally just talked about this in the previous chapter, that Abram made mistakes, and pretty hefty ones at that. Consented adultery, conception of a child through illicit means, consenting to the abuse of a servant. These are not things that God condones, and you understand that communication was cut off from Abram until this time. And 13 years is a long time to never hear from God. I can barely go a day. But also understanding as well, God called Abram blameless. And that's the most important thing. It's not what man thinks about you, it's what God thinks. And God had decided that as he was going to use Abraham, because of his trust in him, that's all that mattered. That's all that counted. Now here he renews his promise to him in verse 2. I will make my covenant between me and you. I will multiply you exceedingly. Note, still no kids yet. At least not through legal means. Then Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be a father of many nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, meaning father, but your name shall be Abraham, father of multitudes, or many nations. For I have made you a father of many nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you. I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you and their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and your descendants after you. So I give to you and your descendants after you all the land in which you are a stranger, all the land of Canaan as an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. So understand that just like God is the one who establishes and places and recognizes the value of when life begins, it was when Hagar was still pregnant with Ishmael, very early on, in fact. God is also the one who decides who is blameless according to his own standard and under what terms they are restored to such status and kept in it. But also understand that with all the debate going on right now about what and who and to whom the land of Israel belongs to, whether it's the Israelites since they were there the longest, whether it's the land squatters of the Ottoman Empire since they were there last, God says it doesn't belong to Israel and it doesn't belong to the Palestinians. They aren't even a real people anyway. They're just Syrian refugees. Sound familiar? The land belongs to God, and he gave it to Israel, specifically to the descendants of Abraham. And now aren't you saying, well, aren't the Arab people descendants of Ishmael, who was a son of Abraham? We're going to discuss when we get into chapter 23, or chapter 22 actually, that God doesn't recognize Ishmael as the son of Abraham. God doesn't recognize the works of our flesh. Ishmael was not a descendant of Abraham in regards to the fact that he inherited God's blessing. That's why he made a different and separate blessing to Hagar. He would be a multitude, and he would be very aggressive, both of which perfectly fulfilled, and God caught it spot on. But they also have a plan for them, that God also loves them, but that the plan that God had for Abraham was being renewed here at 99 years old, and said, you're going to have a baby. Now here is Abram's response. God said, Abram, as for you, you shall keep my covenant, and your descendants after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male of you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins. And it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised. Every male child in your generations, he who is born in your house or bought with money from any foreigner who is not your descendant. He who is born in your house and he who is bought with money, your money, must be circumcised. And my covenant shall be in your flesh, for an everlasting covenant. And the uncircumcised male child who is not uncircumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. Then God said to Abram, as for Sarai your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah, meaning Sarai meant argumentative, difficult, contentious. We see fruits of that. But we also see that God instead called her Sarai, or Sarah, meaning princess. Sarai shall be her name, and I will bless her, and also give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of peoples shall be from her. Now, understand what is happening here. God is giving Abram a new name. Not only has Abram made mistakes, where for all intents and purposes, if he was under contract with God, it would have been violated, the covenant would be discounted, and these 13 years should have continued into the other, I believe, 66 years or 61 years that Abram would live on this earth, and that would be that. That salvation is through works, and that if you violate the law in any part, you are guilty of all. Lock, stock, bond, no grace, no mercy, no love. God demands loyalty, and he has the right to do so. If you don't live according to his standards, he doesn't have to keep you. He chose to. And that's the good news, is that God loves you, values you, chose to save you, even though you didn't deserve it. And noting this as an important reality, what then does this covenant of circumcision bring to light as far as, well, why they would have to do this? Well, circumcision, for those of you who don't know, is involving the male genitalia, their private parts, and they would cut away an area of the foreskin where a number of nerves would be collected. And it was important to do this when you were a baby. You wouldn't even know what happened. 8 days old, emphasize that. But those who come into your home must also complete this action. And this became a real issue of debate after Jesus had established the church as to whether or not people who had not been physically circumcised in regards to the Old Covenant had to keep the law in order to have a relationship with Jesus. And it ultimately came down to this. When Paul wrote the Roman church, and emphasizing again, he discusses this more in Galatians and Philippians and many other of the epistles, that Jesus himself discusses the Pharisees who emphasize the law over God's grace and desire to bring those to him, and anyone who would put barriers between God and man. That's what got Jesus mad. But in Romans chapter 4, and you could read the entire chapter and just understand Paul addresses this issue of circumcision, but I just want to point out to you the main points, and that it discusses this very theme, in that when Abraham was founded as the father of faith, he wasn't saved because he did something. He was saved, so he did something. James actually goes out to point and emphasize this in chapter 2 when he says, I can demonstrate my faith without my works. And then James says, that's great, I'll prove to you my faith by my works. That's not to say that we have to do things to earn or merit salvation. This is where you get into occultic groups. But also understand that if your faith and your genuine belief in God is sincere, you're naturally going to want to do something. If you love someone, it's not a chore to take them out on dates. It's just like, I thought this marriage was based on love, not on date nights. True, but those things help. They form the sincerity, they make it a more enjoyable experience, and they actually, I don't know, provide some more convincing arguments for those who actually say you love each other, so that implies you like being with each other. Maybe you want to do it more often. So this covenant of circumcision, why go after the junk? Why is this being targeted? Well, understand, there's a measure of pleasure that comes out of sexual intimacy. But Abraham was no longer pursuing, especially at this point in his life, he was 99 years old, a life that was meant for his pleasure, but he was there to serve God. So he said, I'd rather cut away the pleasure of my body so that I can pursue and use this tool and instrument that makes babies for your glory, God, instead of my own gratification. So this act of circumcision wasn't to, for any sense, imply or provide salvation. But as Paul quotes in Romans chapter 4 and verse 8, blessed is the man to whom the Lord shall not impute sin. And then again, the previous verses, again quoting David, blessed are those whose lawless deeds are forgiven. And note, that's entirely in the hands of the person that you offend. All sin is against God and God alone. You could read Psalm 51 and verse 4 if you need confirmation on that. But also noting that this blessing that Abraham received was not while he was circumcised. He was told to be circumcised because he was blessed. And this would be a proof and a continued revelation and reality that him and his descendants will be able to say, we are different from every other nation in that we have a physical sign in our bodies, that we don't pursue our own needs. We are living after a spiritual need. And God is the one who meets my needs. He satisfies me so I don't have to pursue a life after the flesh. And that's essentially what's being discussed here. And if you want to read the rest about the promises and the fulfillment of faith, the entire chapter of Romans discusses this very event, and I encourage you to do so. But for time purposes, I want to move on to verse 17, where Abram actually brings up some fruit of his flesh. Before he was circumcised, before he was living a life that actually honored God, there had been some things that had happened in his life, and it had a name. And in fact, it wasn't an it was a he. In verse 17, Abram fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old, and Sarai, who is 90 years old, bear a child? Now, in verse 18, here's where we get to the interesting thing. Abram said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. Now, Abraham did something right in that he laughed for joy, just over-celebrated the fact that, man, God's still going to give me a son. Wait, I have a son. And essentially Abram, or Abraham now, we will refer to him as such into the future. I don't have to check myself on that anymore. Abraham was worried that, as most pagan gods tend to do, if there was any distance between you. They had no problem with child sacrifice. In fact, this was almost expected in that culture. The Canaanites were, in fact, judged by God because the way they dedicated homes of houses was by placing a newborn infant's skull, all was alive, mind you, still skin on top of it, on the brick that would set the foundation for the home and crush it. And the God's favor would be on the house that they offered in sacrifice to the future and potential of that said child. Sounds familiar, like the buildings that we have today. But, again, Abram didn't want to lose Ishmael. God would not ask for child sacrifice, but he essentially was saying, God, can you bless what I've already done? Can't you just give the spiritual blessings to Ishmael? Look at him. Who wouldn't know that I'm his son, right? He's got my eyes, got everything. Come on. Why don't you just bless Ishmael? Now, God's plans are going to remain the same regardless of how we screw it up. And fortunately, God can use our mistakes too. But to quote the pastor of Fresh Life Church in Billings, Montana, Levi Lusko, God would rather be using you and blessing you rather than forgiving you. But he can do both. And understand, and you can do both is on my part, when God blessed Abraham, it was at a very, very long time after and before he had made this first mistake. And note, the consequences, so to speak, had room to grow. Ishmael was 13 years old at this time. He was 86 when Ishmael was born, it says in chapter 16 and verse 16, ironically enough. And in Genesis 17 it said Abraham's 99 years old. So let's do the math. Ishmael is born and hormonal. So what's going to happen to Ishmael? Essentially, that's the question. And God said, no, Sarai, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac, which means laughter. Ironically enough, because when Abraham heard the news he'd have a son, what did he do? He laughed for joy. I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his descendants after him. Now, here's the important point. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him, and I will make him fruitful. I will multiply him exceedingly, and he shall beget 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at the set time next year. So, the baby that made sense would be blessed by Abraham, but wouldn't have the same purpose as Isaac, the miracle child who would be born to Abraham well beyond the means of human help. So understand that this principle that's being introduced, and I want to continue on to chapter 27, we're going to actually be introduced to three main traditions being set in Hebrew culture that are going to be continually significant throughout the Bible due to the fact that there's a principle and rule to theologians known as the law of first mentions. Meaning the first time it's mentioned in the Bible, pay attention because that's going to set the basis for how that term is going to be and should be viewed in context the rest of the times in the Bible. So, going on, after verse 22, when he finished talking with him, God went up from Abraham. So Abraham took Ishmael his son, 13 years old, note this, and note this set of tradition for the Arab tribes as well. All who were born in his house, and all who were bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's house, and circumcised the flesh of their foreskins that very same day. Ouch. As God had said to him, Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, and Ishmael his son was 13 years old, called it, when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. That very same day Abraham was circumcised, and his son Ishmael, and all the men of his house, born in his house, bought with the money from a foreigner, was circumcised with him. So, these three main principles and traditions are being set. The first of which is that the giving of a new name was following redemption. After a major blow-it, God came to Abram, and said, "You are now Abraham. The old man is dead, you are new, and it's because I said so, and I have the right to, because now I'm calling you blessed and blameless in my sight." I'm like, I won't argue, that's cool. So, With this tradition being set, and his household given a new identity, not only in their name, but in their bodies, they had an outward demonstration of a physical reality. But then, God's promises are fulfilled in chapter 18, in which we will be discussing 3 founding principles that are the first mentions of such in the Bible and need to be taken note of, because they will be mentioned often later in the Old Testament and in the New, and based off of how they are mentioned and in what context here, they will be properly interpreted and determined into the future. So, then the Lord appeared to him by the terebinth trees of Mamre, as he was sitting in the tent door in the heat of the day. So he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing by him. And when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them, and bowed himself to the ground and said, "My Lord, if I have now found favor in your sight, do not pass on by your servant." Who did Abraham serve? "Please let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree, and I will bring a morsel of bread that you may refresh your hearts, that after you may pass by, inasmuch as you have come to your servant." They said, do as you have said. So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah and said, "Quickly, make 3 measures of fine meal kneaded in to make cakes." And Abraham ran to the herd, took a tender and good calf, gave it to a young man, and he hastened to prepare it. So he took butter, and he milk in the calf from which he had prepared, and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree as they ate. Then they said to him, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" So he said, "Here in the tent." And he said, note there's a capital H there, "I will certainly return to you according to the time of life, and behold, Sarah your wife shall have a son." Now, here's where it gets fun. Sarah was listening in the tent door which was behind them. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, well advanced in age, and Sarah had passed the age of childbearing, menopause, long distant memory. Therefore Sarah laughed within herself. Funny, Abraham did the same thing earlier. "After I have grown old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also?" And the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh?" No, now the Lord's in here. Oh, he was already there. And the Lord said to Abram, "Why did Sarah laugh, saying, Shall I surely bear a child since I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time I will return to you, according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied it, saying, "I didn't laugh," for she was afraid. And he said, "No, you did." Don't really get away much with God. These 3 traditions, very amusingly founded, and the law of first mentions demands them as such. The first of which is unleavened bread. You guys remember this would be later implied in Exodus and in the Gospels during the life of Jesus in what's known as the Passover ceremony. Unleavened bread would later be an example of something free from sin, like yeast would then be later used as an example of sin permeating and causing by death it to rise and become more in appearance than what it actually was. But the food that God was able to eat in fellowship with Abraham, what allowed God to eat and become one with, because note, they didn't have separate plates, they just took a bit and bit it off, and there weren't any napkins, and if they had any food to dip it in, any butter, it was just wiped off from their hands. So not only is food being shared, but germs are being shared. And God doesn't mind germs. And frankly, I don't mind Jesus' germs either. But note, this fellowship, back in that culture and in that day, and also understanding consistently to this day, that eating with someone in the Middle East is an implication going on all the way into Revelation, in which we'll use this, that God dining with us means becoming not only one flesh, but one spirit with us, sharing his heart with us. And it's done so through a sinless example, unleavened bread. The second is, of course, like we talked about before, an example of a theophany. This law of first mentions was, again, God acting incarnate, in appearance as a man to man. Now this is pre-Jesus Christ, so note, John wasn't kidding in John chapter 1 when he said the Word was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him. The Word, in the beginning was the Word was with God. The Word was God. They're the same dude, just separate in identity, but equal in their identity or in their title as God. So again, Purple Mist commercial. One more thing we won't understand about him, but here he is. So, a theophany. That God would interact with man in this way. But we've also seen this happen beforehand as well, that God interacted with Adam and Eve when they were sinless in the garden. God interacted with Hagar in a time where she needed help. And God interacted with Abraham simply when he wanted to hang out. That's an important thing to note. And then the founding of names. Now, Isaac would be the name of the child because of an event in relation to his character or birth, and these would continue to be traditions in Hebrew and Arab culture. And you're going to see this when we get into the life of Jacob and Isaac and his children, and as well the character of Jesus himself, that normally when you would name a child, that was actually, and we'll get into this when we get into the time of the kings, but that's actually how they justified abortion back in the days. If the child didn't have a name, it wasn't fully human, because they oftentimes wouldn't name a baby until about a week into their birth, conveniently as much as such. That's why God said don't circumcise them until the 8th day, because traditionally you wouldn't name them until the end of the week. You'd watch to see what they would do. For example, Jacob and Esau. Esau came out and well, when we get into it, it'll go into more details, but essentially the Bible doesn't pull punches and says it was hairy. It was a hairy baby. Like, who does it look like? Chewbacca? I don't know. And that's what happened. And then they named him Esau because that means hairy. And then as they were pulling the baby out of mom, they noticed there was another arm attached to Harry's heel, and he's like, oh man, this one's playing smart, not hard. He's trying to, like, you know, when the two people are running like Nacho Libre, and he's trying to hold the skeleton back so that he can get in first place. It's classic 3rd grade stuff. That's what was happening here, so they named him Jacob, heel catcher, cheater, one who catches by the heel. So these would be followers of that said tradition. And note and understand that this would be upon giving and essentially the establishing of new life. Jacob would also be given a new name as well into his life, but we'll wait to tell you what that one is when we get into his life and legacy. So, going on to verse 16, interesting events. Then the men rose from there and looked toward Sodom. And Abraham went with them to send them on the way. And the Lord said, Shall I hide from Abraham what I am doing? Since Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. For I have known him, in order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they keep the way of the Lord, to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has spoken to him. And the Lord said, Because of the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grave, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry against it that has come to me, and if not, I will know. Now, did God have to make a personal appearance? Wasn't he already technically there? Isn't he omnipresent? Yes, but God likes to make personal and temporal warnings in advance before announcing judgment on the sin of a nation, to give them a chance to repent even if he knows they won't accept it. Sound familiar? #Noah's Ark. And the men turned away from there and went toward Sodom, but Abraham still stood before the Lord. And Abraham came near and said, Would you also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there were 50 righteous within the city. Would you also destroy the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous that were in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing as this, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous should be as the wicked. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? So the Lord said, If I find in Sodom 50 righteous people, then I will spare all the place for their sakes. Then Abram said, Indeed now I who am but dust and ashes have taken upon myself to speak to the Lord. Suppose there were 5 less than the 50 righteous. Would you destroy all the city for the lack of 5? So he said, the Lord, If I find 45, I will not destroy it. And he spoke to him yet again and said, suppose there's 40 found there. And he said, I will not destroy it for 40. And so on and so forth this goes. He says, you're going to do it for 30? If I find 30 there, I'll spare the whole city. Well, what about 20? I will not destroy it for the sake of 20. And then, don't be angry. I'll speak just once more. What about 10? And he said, I will not destroy it for the sake of 10. So the Lord went his way as soon as he had finished speaking with Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. Now, what's happening here isn't essentially a bidding war or a storage wars haggling between Abraham and the Lord as far as how merciful he's going to be. What Abraham was given a chance to be right then and there was to share the heart of God. Now, we need to understand not only Abraham's motives for wanting to give two rips about Sodom. Why? Because he knew his nephew Lot was living in the city. That for the sake of the one person he loved, he was willing to let all the evil continue longer for the sake of sparing the life of the person that he cared most about. But understand, where did that heart come from? Who was given that capacity to care for life even when it doesn't make theological or moral sense? This was Abraham getting an opportunity to be an example of the Father and an illustration thereof as far as how he relates to man and how he judges sin. For those that he's deemed innocent, he's delaying judgment. If I look at my own nation, I say we deserve more than a meteor shower. But because his church is still on the earth, God's sparing the whole place, which is why the rapture of the church is so significant. When God's people are taken out of the way after a prophetic warning is fulfilled, judgment falls, and it falls quickly. He haggles it down to 10 people, and we also need to understand that God's supernaturally judging the world's evil and sin right now is because we are in it. But when we get into verse 19, this is what the conditions in Sodom were like, and also the identity of the two men who were with the Lord. Now the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. It's usually the role of a city leader, so probably has made a name for himself as one of the people. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them. He bowed himself with his face toward the ground and said, Hear now, my lords, lowercase l, please turn into your servant's house and spend the night. Wash your feet. You may rise early and go on your way. So you see, Lot learned a lot from his uncle. And they said, No, we will spend the night in the open square. But he insisted strongly. He thinks he knows what's happening in the parades tonight. So they turned into him and entered his house. Then he made them a feast, baked unleavened bread, and they ate. Now before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both old and young, men, all the people from every quarter surrounded the house. And they called to Lot and said to him, Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we might know them carnally. We want to rape those two angels, those two new guys that came into the city. You think the gay parades are something new nowadays. They're not. So Lot went out to them through the doorway, shut the door behind him, and said, Please, my brethren, he tries to be civil, do not do so wickedly. See now, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Please, let me bring them out to you, and you may do to them as you wish. Only do nothing to these men, since this is the reason why they have come under the shadow of my roof. Lot's a scumbag. Cares more about the lives of these 2 angels than his own daughter's purity and probably their lives. And they said, something we have heard much today, Stand back. Then they said, This one came in to stay here, and he keeps acting as a judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them. Don't judge me. Don't tell me how to live my life. Don't tell me what's right or wrong. Now we're going to rape you even worse than we were planning on doing it to them. So they pressed hard against the man Lot, and they came near to break down the door. But the men reached out their hands and pulled Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck the men who were at the door with the house with blindness, both small and great, so that they became weary trying to find the door. They didn't give up either. This sounds too familiar for me to be comfortable, is it? Anywho, verse 12. Then the men said to Lot, "Have you anyone else here, son-in-law, your sons, your daughters, and whomever you have in the city? Take them out of this place." So before judgment fell, the angel said, "Spare the lives of anyone you can. Your children, your family, those who are married into your family, anyone who will listen to you. Get them out now. For," verse 13, "we will destroy this place because of the outcry against them has grown great before the face of the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it." Oh, God's so unfair. Really? Really? Fair prophetic warning. Sent two angels. Tried to rape the angels to death. Said went after the daughters. Raped the man who tried to give them the warning. Maybe show even some decency. How many did God say he would spare the entire city for? Call off the whole ordeal? 10. Guess how many righteous people he found? 1. And it was time for him to leave with as many as would listen to him. So Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law who had married his daughters and said, "Get up, get out of this place, for the Lord will destroy this city." But to his sons-in-law he seemed to be joking. He tried. They didn't listen. Sad that that's the majority today as well. When the morning dawned, the angels urged Lot to hurry, saying, "Arise, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be consumed in the punishment of this city." And while he lingered, the men took hold of his hand, his wife's hand, and the hands of his 2 daughters, the Lord being merciful to him. And they brought him out and set him outside the city. So it came to pass, when they had brought them outside, that he said, "Escape for your life, and don't look behind you, nor stay anywhere in the plain. Escape to the mountains, lest you be destroyed." So it wasn't enough that Lot was given a pass out. How did the angels get Lot out of the city? They had to drag him, and his wife, and his 2 daughters. Because 1, 2, second angel, 3, 4. That's all they could carry. So, came to pass when they had brought them outside, they said, "Escape with your life and don't look back." Then Lot said to them, verse 18, "Please know, my lords, indeed now your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have increased your mercy by which you have shown me by saving my life. But I cannot escape to the mountains, lest some evil overtake me and I die. There's robbers up there, but there's animals, there's disease. What am I going to do? God's not going to take care of me, even though he's taken care of me thus far." So the angels, showing a good measure of patience, he said, "See now, this city is near enough to flee to, and it is a little one. Please let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my soul shall live? Can I just do this little sin over here?" He said to him, "See, I have favored concerning this thing also, that I will not overthrow the city which you have spoken. Hurry, escape there, for I cannot do anything until you arrive there." Therefore the name of the city was called Zorar, which means little or insignificant. Oh, it's just a little sin. The sun had risen upon the earth when Lot entered Zoar. Then the Lord rained brimstone and fire on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. So he overthrew those cities, all the plain, all the inhabitants of the cities, and what grew on the ground. But his wife looked back behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. I don't know if this was a crater by impact or a result of supernatural witnessing and going all Raiders of the Lost Ark on us, but it's important to follow the details, isn't it? And Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord. Then he looked toward Sodom and Gomorrah, toward all the land of the plain, and saw and behold the smoke of the land, which went up like the smoke of a furnace. And it came to pass, when God destroyed the cities of the plain, that God remembered Abraham, and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, when he overthrew the cities in which Lot dwelt in. All right, now I'm going to not go into too much detail about this because it's just plain gah. But Lot, again, is called a righteous man in the book of James. In Hebrews 11, he's considered one amongst the fathers of faith. And that's encouraging for us to know because he wasn't really what you'd consider a good and moral man. In the conception of two nations. Lot went up from Mount Zoar, dwelt in the mountains, his 2 daughters with him, for he was afraid to dwell in Zoar. And he and his 2 daughters dwelt in a cave. Now the firstborn said to the younger, Our father is old, and there is no man on the earth to come to us, as is the custom of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, meaning we will have sex with him, that we may preserve the lineage of our father. Looks like these girls weren't too moral and Christian either. So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with their father, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. So Lot was willing to get blacked out drunk and didn't even know who he had slept with, knowing it was his own daughter. It happened on the next day when the firstborn said to the younger, Indeed, I lay with my father last night. Let us make him drink father tonight also, that you may go in and lie with him, that we may preserve the lineage of our father. They made their father drink, yada yada, that happened. So verse 36, but thus both the daughters of Lot were with child by their father. This firstborn bore a son, and called his name Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day, again a great enemy of Israel, and cursed by God. And the younger, she also bore a son, and called his name Ben-Ami. He is the father of the people of Ammon, the Ammonites to this day. Again, great enemies of God. And again, finishing this chapter, we get yet another example that Abraham, even given his new life, still made mistakes. Verse 20, or chapter 20, verse 1, Abraham journeyed there from the south and dwelt between Kadesh and Shur and stayed in Gerar. Now Abraham said of Sarai his wife, Sarah, She is my sister. Not again. But God, so Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah, added her to his flesh and tissue porn collection. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, Indeed, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife. This is 4. But Abimelech had not come near to her. They hadn't had sex yet. And he said, Lord, will you slay a righteous nation also? Did he not say to me, She is my sister? And even though she said herself, He is my brother, in the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands, I have done this. And God said to him in a dream, Yes, I know you did this in the integrity of your heart. Well, he didn't say innocence of your hands. For I also withheld you from sinning against me. Therefore I did not let you touch her. Now therefore restore the man's wife, for he is a prophet. And he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not restore her, know that you shall surely die, and all who are yours. So Abimelech rose early in the morning, called all his servants, and took all these things and told all these things in their hearing. And the men were very much afraid. And Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, What have you done to us? How have I offended you, that you have brought on me and on my kingdom a great sin? You have done deeds to me that ought not to be done. Then Abimelech said to Abraham, What did you have in view that you have done this thing? But Abraham said, Because I thought surely the fear of God is not in this place, and they will kill me on account of my wife. But indeed she is truly my sister. She is the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother. You understand, when we go back to verse 15, that was going on. But she came to be, and she became my wife. And it came to pass, when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, This is your kindness, that whatever you do for me in every place, wherever we go, say that he is my brother. Then Abimelech took sheep, oxen, male and female servants, gave them to Abraham, restored Sarah his wife to him. And Abimelech said, See, my land is before you. Dwell wherever it pleases. Dwell wherever it pleases you. Then Sarah said, Behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Indeed, this vindicates you before all who are with you and before everybody. Thus she was rebuked. So, there's a price of redemption there. And Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech his wife, his female servants, and then they bore children, for God had closed up all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abram's wife. So, finishing this, as far as where we go tonight, as far as the legacy of Abraham and all the things that he's done, We understand that the things that he witnessed, the things that he performed, there were times where God worked through him, the things that God did to him, and the things that God had said are of him. But the only things that could really be said were of eternal significance and worth including in this Bible. When God demonstrated his heart for us through Abraham, that was recorded as a moment of righteousness. When Abraham trusted God and obeyed his command to circumcise himself and cut off the life of the flesh. No, it didn't mean he didn't pursue it, but he obeyed God, and he trusted in the promise and covenant, and a baby would be born to him, he believed. Now, we know historically that the baby we're going to be reading about, the legacy of Isaac, next chapter, was not an accident child by Abimelech. It was Abraham's child. And also noting impressively that God was able to keep Sarah virile enough to be as attractive as she was, even at the age of 99. Understand that all these things bring back that one main point. This is the father of faith, ladies and gentlemen. Abraham screws up the exact same way by doubting God once again. Now here's the good news. God doesn't love him based on a contract. Otherwise he'd be fired by now. The good news is for you and me, that if God could use Abraham, he could use us also, because he's not a God who expects perfection. He is our perfection. He is our provision. He is our righteousness. He is our satisfaction. And just like they could circumcise themselves knowing that part of their flesh wouldn't be missed, understand anything that you lose to gain more of Jesus is well worth it. Because while we are making a difficult transition from fear to faith and counting what we lose instead of what God has given, Abraham took some time to learn that lesson too. But because he simply trusted God, that's all that mattered, and that's all that counted, both for you and for me. If you have questions concerning this study or would like to know more concerning the time that we did not have to go into detail about these passages, leave them in the comments below. If they're sincere, I'd be more than happy to discuss them. If you'd like to encourage the ministry, leave a like and subscribe. But most importantly, if you know someone who hasn't heard these passages discussed, maybe they haven't heard the Bible in its proper context, or thinks that you have to be perfect to get into heaven, find example that that's not the case. God is our perfection, and if you have him, you have it. That's all that he expects from you, is for you to trust him, for you to follow him, and to admit when you've messed up. That's all that matters. That's all that was accounted for Abraham for salvation, and it hasn't changed. We just look back instead of Abraham when he looked ahead. Thank you for your time and listening to this study, and God bless you.